Good morning. Welcome to Radio Row at Super Bowl in Los Angeles, California. We are here today with Tim Harrington, Roy Kessler, and myself to talk about the stigma in abuse. Tim, I'm gonna let you introduce yourself, and I'm gonna let Roy moderate this panel. Okay, guys?
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sounds good. Good to be here with you guys. Los Angeles Super Bowl week. What a big deal. I really appreciate the opportunity to come and speak with you guys. I am a family recovery coach. So what that means is that for the last 14 years, I have focused on what is one of the most important assets to a healing process. Because why this is important is typically in this process, they're not getting a lot of juice. They're getting about 10% of the juice when they deserve certainly equal amount of the juice because of the important role they play. So I've really made it my business to, in the world of treatment, to yell as loud as I can. So let's pay more attention to the family because that gives us the best chance of success in this process of healing for people who have addiction. So I've been doing that. I have a family. I live in Los Angeles. I live in Malibu with my family, my wife, my two daughters, Lily and Chloe, and Robin's my wife, and I have two dogs, Elvis and Priscilla. I'm very proud of them. They're literally the glue that holds us together. They certainly have been during COVID. We couldn't have done it without them. They just bring us that unrequited love and joy to the family, and always happy to see you. They're just amazing. So that's what I dedicate my life to: family, helping families, my own family, which we might get into here, and then treatment and stigma is a big one. We'll probably talk more about that and what we did for that a couple of years ago.
Well, Tim, I know you and I have known each other a long time. I think it's important for people to understand why this became such an important issue for you and how you got into this area.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'll throw a couple of statistics at you just to give it some context. There are about 23 million people who are symptomatic for substance use disorder in the United States. And typically only about 10% of them consume services to address that issue. So we have a huge gap of people out there who, in one stage or another, are on the spectrum, who are struggling with accessing treatment, help, feeling like talking about it, even understanding it, what the heck is going on with me, because most of the time, I think it's important for people to realize is that there's a lot of co-occurring issues. And what that means is that we've got people who have anxiety disorders, major depression, potentially bipolar, schizophrenia, in cahoots, if you will, with addiction. And what I want to say about this is when I was a kid, I struggled way before I had a drink with anxiety. I was an anxious kid. I was very disruptive. That's one way of describing it in class. Although I was welcomed, I wasn't necessarily punished. I was, very often talked to by the teacher to say, we love having you here and you say funny things, but you're kind of being disruptive. And it was they handled it, I think, pretty well. Other kids not so well, because there's also a spectrum of kids who have issues in classrooms, ADHD being one that I think most people are familiar with. But many people just have a temperament of not being able to sit still. And I think this is important because sort of the foundation of what I do has to do with compassion. It has to do with being curious about someone's story and not just organizing around the behavior and symptoms of somebody. I think we can all relate to that because what we're trying to do is sort of control the situation in the moment. But what we get to do, whether we're a parent or a teacher or a treatment provider, this is what I talk about a lot, is sort of know what's going on behind the scenes for this person, if that makes sense. Not just the behavior and symptoms, because when a kid comes to your class or when a kid comes to you and needs help, they have a full story. They have years and years of a story that deserves to be told. And so my story was a kid who was anxious, a kid who was from a home that was chaotic. There was relationship issues, there was divorce, there was abandonment, there was abuse, all of those things. And I tell you, sitting here from the armchair quarterback position, we'll use that here at Super Bowl week, is that what I know about that is that all of those things brought to bear, plus my family situation, susceptibility to drinking and smoking was 100%, because that's what everybody was doing in my family. So all putting that all together and then meeting you here today is to say that everything that I went through, everything that I dealt with is honest and valuable and truth that brings me to a place of power and position so that I can eloquently share with people and help them on this journey with families so they can understand in context. Because again, what's happening is people are in crisis, they are freaking out, and so they manage this from a symptom and behavior standpoint. We want to change that.
Tim, can I hop in there for a second? Because I think what you're saying is so true. And I work with a lot of the professional athletes, and we hear these same kind of stories where either it's the kids or the moms who are just like, honey, I can't do this anymore.
Yes.
I'm stuck. It's either you have to change or I have to leave.
That's right.
I'm just curious, Tim, what is your advice? To the athletes, we understand the stress, we understand the physical concerns, the concussions, why they may be turning to drugs to alleviate some of the pain, some of the physical symptoms that they're experiencing. Can we talk for just a minute in your professional experience specifically to those athletes and your word for them?
Yeah, okay. So part of my story growing up was I was an athlete. I played soccer for about 15 years, starting very young and involved in school teams, club teams, all of that. And there were injuries all the time. You use your head in soccer. So there is now evidence being gathered in terms of how do we proactively deal with that kind of thing. Because in my experience over the last 19 years, many people who develop a relationship with substances, pain relievers, painkillers, have a TBI. And it's something that very few people ask about in the treatment space. And I always do. I said, what about a TBI? And they're like, yeah, he did fall out of his crib and then he fell out of a tree. And it's just important because all that information matters. So it's a combination law, right? It's not one thing. It's never one thing. It's a complex issue in the sense that it's emotional, it's biological, it's psychological, it's environmental, it's all of these things. So like I said earlier, we become more powerful in the conversation when we respect context, Kayla. And Roy, this is super important. Whether we're talking to a loved one, a colleague, a friend, a family member of any kind, family of origin, family of choice, we talk with them as if they have a past. That we don't just talk about the behavior, we don't just talk about the use. Because guys, addiction, the experience of addiction doesn't come in bottles and cans, it comes in systems. Okay, this is really important for your audience to understand, because also we can point to some really, pretty staggering statistics and how much money we've spent on the war on drugs. And ultimately, this is a very complex issue because at its roots is race, and we must respect that because we have an inequitable relationship with the way we perceive drug users and drug use in this country. And it's incredibly important that we address this, because if we're going to get out in front of this finally, we have to own that. We have to rebuke the idea that prohibition is the answer. We have to rebuke the idea that punishment is the answer. We have to rebuke the idea of any answer other than compassion and empathy and understanding, and really doing a deep dive into this person's experience, their environmental experience. Because what we know is that the environment turns on the genetics, turns on this for many, many years. In fact, recent history would believe that genetics really drove everything. And somebody started saying, no, we have to look at environment. And so I'm going to say something that I think that I've learned over the last 19 years is that this is not a medical issue. This is a social issue. This is sociology. This is environment. This is how people grow up. This is poverty. This is inequality. This is employment. This is emotional at its core. Because when we're challenged as human beings with these things we're talking about, these social determinants of health, housing, employment, finance, all of these things, education,
Tim, I think one of the things that you brought up that was really interesting is you talked about your sports career. You were an elite soccer player from a very early age. You, as I recall, in high school, you were one of two people that made varsity as a freshman, which was very unusual at that point in time. And I'd love to hear you talk about how, in a sense, that pressure that you put on yourself or may have felt from others impacted what you went through.
Yes. On in my environment at the same time that I was sort of peaking and moving on from high school into the college world as far as sports goes, what was going on in my household was chaos and abuse, violence. Relationships were imploding, divorce was happening, other people were having their challenges. My brother was having his challenges as he was trying to deal with the pain that he was feeling from his background as far as abuse and neglect and abandonment goes. So everything sort of reaches its apex at some point, and it's different for everybody, right? We like to say that it kind of starts with as fun and then fun with problems and then just problems. There's a progression to it because, again, you're not getting the proper intervention. A lot of times it's psychopharmacology, go see a doctor, get on Prozac. I'm not saying anything that's wrong with that, but it's sort of a magic bullet approach, and we really need to talk about this in a holistic, integrated way, right? Does that make sense? So when I was getting to that point where I was struggling, where my emotional world and my emotional pain was apex, so was my career. So when those things came together, there was an explosion. And when I got the news that I didn't get accepted into the University of Wisconsin because my grades had been affected at that time, and I also had a reputation, by the way, for being a little bit mouthy, one might say, or I did argue with the ref from time to time. I did get my share of red cards, but that all was what was going on behind the scenes was that was an expression of that, right? And nobody ever said what's happened to you. They were like, what's wrong with you? What's the matter with you? Those kinds of things, you know what I mean? And you're like, you're looking at people, and nobody really wants to know. And this is one of the big things I talk with people when I speak is I say we need to stop saying what's wrong with you and say what happened to you, because again, that's where we're going to get to that.
That's a really interesting point, because Kayla and I were having that conversation recently about that whole expression and how different it makes somebody feel if I look over at them and say, "What's wrong with you?" compared to "What are you feeling?" And it's really interesting that you brought that up.
It's so powerful because, again, that's the compassion piece. That's really the main ingredient, right? When we're seeing somebody struggling, they're telling us something about something they need, but they're saying it in a way that it's not articulated the best, but because they're emotionally flooded, right? And by the time it gets to the point where it's like, Kayla, you were saying, like when families make their bottom lines, when they say either you change or you're out of here or any of that, how many signs have we had up until that point, the breaking point, right? So when we talk about early intervention, it can't be, or prevention, it can't be, again, modeled around just say no or stop doing the drugs and stop with the behavior and the symptoms will go away. That's symptom care. And we could, that's a long conversation about our healthcare system. It's really symptom care. And so it's really important, incredibly important as far as prevention and early intervention, is that we really start dealing that compassion card at a high level and say, what do you need? Like, because what I can tell you is that in a lot of studies that in the last couple of years that have been done in ERs around overdose, when they ask the patient what they need, not one of them has ever said more treatment. Not one. What they have said is, I need food, I need a job, I need a place to live. And underneath that, if they could articulate it, if they thought anybody would listen, they would say, I need to be loved. I need to be seen, heard, appreciated for what I've been through, the pain that I'm in, right? All of those things. That is how we turn the tide. We don't turn the tide by suing farm. We don't. That's not how we turn this around. We don't turn it around by turning up the heat, on the war on drugs. We don't turn it around by lawsuits and going after, the pharmacology, the pharmacy companies and all that. That's not going to do it. We need to really get down in what I call the humanification of this process. And the humanification of the experience of addiction and mental health is like we were just talking about. What happened to you? What what are your needs? Because what we've led with is, I'll tell you what my needs are. I need you to stop doing what you're doing because it's really stressing me out. You know what I mean? So when I coach families, I'm mitigating that stress. I'm teaching them how to be in relationship with somebody who is experiencing addiction, and that's a job that takes a high level of skill. I know people love the ones that are struggling. That's not the issue. It's how. So we're teaching people how.
So, Tim, I have to ask you a question about that. I live in Milwaukee. To some extent, there is a relatively major homeless crisis in Milwaukee, but holy smokes, I come out here to LA. Roy and I are driving through last night from here at Radio Row, and there are just hundreds of people laying on the sidewalks, and we're at the intersection of compassion and crisis. And I said to Roy, my heart is breaking. Nobody says when I grow up, I want to be a homeless drug addict.
No.
And I'm not, by any means, I am not saying that every person who's homeless has an issue with addiction. But Tim, we have so many very real problems. You talked a little bit earlier about stigma.
Yeah.
We need to talk about treatment. You mentioned compassion, you mentioned empathy.
Yeah.
In your experience as a professional,
Yeah.
what's the answer, Tim?
This is the answer. We must attack stigma with everything we've got, because stigma holds everything back. The reason why we still have an unhoused problem, and by the way, you mentioned something really important. The majority of people who are homeless or unhoused, we call them now, are not addicted to drugs. Not even half. That again, that's a trope, that's a narrative, that's a stigma. Okay. What we get to do, like we do with individuals, is we don't say, what's wrong with you? Why aren't you motivated? Why are you lazy? Whatever the trope is that we've been acculturated and socialized to believe about people who aren't performing at a certain standard in our society. And by the way, that's a very small percentage of people. Most people are contributing. Most people are producing and consuming like we're supposed to. You know what I mean? So it's not that it's like, it's overwhelming because it's in our face all the time, and it's sad and it's emotional. But look, guys, this is America. I think we've lost the plot in America. If I can get tiny bit political, but it isn't really. It's really like we've sort of lost our plot in the sense that, what is the idea of America? The idea of America for me was we can do anything that we put our minds to, right? When we decided to go to the moon, we went to the moon, right? We did. So it isn't a matter of ability or capability. This is a matter of choice. Okay, so if we can stop saying that we don't have this or this resource or this wealth or this ability, I'll talk with you all day long about the choices that we're making, because it really comes down to that, right? I say that with people that I coach. There isn't anybody I coach, whether they're in the depths of their addiction, whether they can move forward in that. I don't believe that at all. It isn't about ability. It's really about choice. So let's talk about choice. Let's talk about your ability to make choices, right? Which is what we do all day, every day, right? All of us, we make choices all day, every day. So let's talk about what gets in your way. What are the challenges, right? What are the challenges in society as far as social supports, as far as the social determinants of health, access to training, education, finance, all of that stuff. Like, let's talk about that. But let's not talk about the trope of like, I feel so, the pity and stuff like that, right? Because that's not gotten us anywhere. We have the ability. We're making choices that continue to perpetuate this problem. And that comes down to leadership. So I call out the leaders. I don't say this is an untenable situation. It's the decisions you're making that have kept us in this loop around overdose, around homelessness, the unhoused. All of that is about choice. So let's talk about that.
Tim, I love it. I know that we want to talk about treatment and family support as well. I'd also like to hear whether or not, in your opinion, marijuana and the medical use of marijuana and CBD as a gateway drug for our athletes, or whether or not it's a cure. But before we do, I want to remind our listeners that we are here on Radio Row in Los Angeles, California, reporting live from Radio Row. Roy Kessel, Caleb Bradham, Tim Harrington, talking about the very real dangers, hopes, and solutions of addiction.
Yeah,
Tim.
it's great to be here, guys, and I really appreciate this forum, this platform. I love that you guys are interested in this and want to talk about this at a high level and ongoing, the health issues that surround people in sports. It's super, super important. We see it at a high level because we have professional athletes that fairly regularly are having these challenges, and it's a super important thing. But again, the idea, every time I see a report, I always say, like, punishment is what I see. All right. Now, you get punished for driving under the influence. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is that once that is taken care of, there's more punishment around that instead of help, compassion. Let's get you treatment. Let's not punish you to the point with taking away what you love. In fact, that's one of the things that helps people maintain more health, is that they're connected with what they love to do. So taking that away is really the absolute last thing that we should do, disconnecting somebody from what they're connected to at a high level that fills their heart. Okay, so I'm going to say that. What I also want to say is that the treatment space, again, treats about 16,000 treatment centers who specialize in substance use disorder, treat about 10% of 23 million people. Okay, that leaves a lot of people out there trying to figure out what they're going to do about this. And another thing I don't think your audience knows is there's about 23 million approximately in long-term recovery from substance use disorder in America. I'm going to say it again. There's 23 million people, a year or more, who have resolved an issue as defined by the DSM-5, substance use disorder. Okay, so let's think about that. Let's take that in. What that means is hope. Now, in the treatment world, in the intervention world, what we can do, the best that we can do, is that we can shorten the career of a person who's experiencing addiction / mental health, emotional health issues. So that's really what our job is. There is no cure. There's management. There's intervention. And the key to that intervention, again, is, I want to mention this again to everybody, is what happened to you, not what's wrong with you, what's the matter with you. Labels are for bottles and cans. That doesn't help people. That's another level of stigma. Okay, so when we call somebody an addict, somebody said Johann Hari, who's a great author. Please look him up. He wrote a book called Lost Connections, and he wrote a book about addiction. And what he said is that the cure to addiction, as he said, is connection, right? And that's what I want our audience to go away with this from, ultimately, is that we learn to be relational with people who are struggling with something that is emotional, that is overwhelming. But the antidote or the intervention is always going to be relational. It's not going to be taking away the drugs. It's not going to be punishment. That initially just exacerbates the problem. It actually keeps people in the loop of this re-addiction, resumption of use, treatment, resumption of use, jail, all that stuff, okay? That has got to stop. The societal cost of that is astronomical, right? And so the intervention, again, and this is what I want people to take from this, is relational. It's societal. Let's connect the dots here. Let's connect the dots to reducing a career is going to be addressing the social determinants of health, education, housing, employment. And then it's going to be relational in the sense that what happened to you? What is your story? You deserve to be witnessed, heard, recognized, because those things that were perpetrated on you that necessarily drove you in a different direction to right downtown here, where the mission is, and all of this homeless that has been cleaned up nicely, I saw when I came down here temporarily, is that every one of those persons has a story, okay? They were 5 years old. They were playing. They wanted to be a cowboy, an astronaut. Let's do the humanification process and recognize that person as a human, not a set of statistics, not a diagnosis, because that, again, makes it impersonal. So I can distance myself from you then. I can make excuses for why it still exists by perpetrating stigma on you, by calling you an addict, by calling you an abuser, a substance abuser. Don't use abuse anymore, people. Please don't use substance abuse. If it's anywhere in your languaging in your company or in your family, get rid of it. Just call each other by your name. Let's not reference anybody as an addict or a substance abuser or an alcoholic. Johann Hari, I mentioned him earlier. What I want to say about labels is that labels tell inaccurate stories. Remember that. A label tells an inaccurate story. It doesn't tell the story of the person. It makes them a stereotype. And again, that impersonalization allows me to distance myself so I don't participate in the solution. Because if I think you're an addict, I already know who you are, I already know what you do, and I have a certain perception of you. And that prevents us from getting close to that person to actually ask them exactly what happened to them. What were you like at 5 years old? What were your dreams? Did you want to be an astronaut, fireman, policeman, whatever? Right? Now we can start being relational with people. And that is going to get us quicker to the solution. That is going to make it for a more effective intervention so that we can start to get down to what really drives systems, and that is saving money, right? Because this is an expensive system. This is an expensive system with a very questionable return on investment. So if we can talk about how much does it save by using this type of intervention, where we find out what's going on with them, where they came from, make it relational, make it human.
Tim, I love the way you describe that, because I think you talk about the labels let us distance ourselves from the person. And as Kayla and I were driving and looking around, we talked about the fact that for most people, you're really only two or three differences in your life away from
It's very
being
true.
in that
That's
situation.
something that doesn't get enough press to make an impact, so people can start thinking about how tenuous, everything that we've set up, the way it looks, where we live, what we drive, our jobs, whatever, our relationships even. It's really important to start talking about the context of those things and exactly how far we are away. We're a pandemic away. We're a health issue away. We're so close to that. And let's talk about the unhoused. The majority of the unhoused have always been people who ended up there because of exactly what you just said, Roy. It was literally a rent payment. It was a medical emergency, a medical bankruptcy, a loss of a job. People are, if you look at the statistics, somewhere around an average of $500 away, I think, from not being able to really cover it all. And then most of the time they're borrowing from Peter to pay Paul. That's why we have a credit issue in this country, is because of the inequity, because of how much we've paid people. And the reason I'm saying this stuff is because it's all connected. Everything is connected, right? It goes to the guy who ends up, or the woman or the person who ends up homeless, in a lot of pain and a lot of toxic stress. And then somebody that they're homeless with says, you need some relief. Why don't you drink? You know what I mean? Like, it's stressful out here, right? You're sleeping on the streets. So instead of having the compassion for the reason why somebody engages in drug use, instead of calling them a drug user or a substance abuser, which, by the way, the vast majority of people who are consuming illicit drugs or otherwise aren't doing it problematically or chaotically. Okay, so let's recognize that the label is completely unfounded, because the majority of people are just using it in a way for relaxation or recreation. It's important to know.
Tim, I think that's so important. And we talk about the majority of people, right? When you say that, it brings up two very real issues for me. One, again, going back to my community where I live in, and we come from the same area because you went to school, grew up in Madison,
Yep.
right? So in Milwaukee, I'm going to say, let's look at a football team. I'm just going to be blunt. Like, kid gets caught with a little pinky fingernail of cocaine. They're probably going to get benched for a few days. Coach is going to chew their butt out. They're going to get a big lecture. That's probably going to be about the end of it. You're a black kid in Milwaukee. I can pretty much certainly guarantee that you're going to do some time for that. So I want to talk about the racial issues involved in drugs. The other thing I want to talk about is going back to the concept, is marijuana, CBD, are these gateway drugs? Do they have a place in the athlete's life, or should we be finding other coping strategies? Tim, what do you think?
Yeah. So first, the inequitable treatment of people participating in the same activity with the same substance This should not even be controversial at all. We should, at a high level, every single person in the United States should know that the initial war on drug policy was driven by racism, was driven by control, was driven by the ability to maintain the status quo in terms of white supremacy. Let's just call it what it is. I mean, to maintain control, basically. Control and domination was really the policy. With people, brown, people of color, anybody of color, certainly who are already disadvantaged. And we just threw another thing in the mix to really, kick people when they're down. And so that's super important. Now, as far as a big thing that people like to talk about is the gateway drug, right? What is a gateway drug? Well, there is no gateway drug. Okay, that's a misnomer. There's nothing medical about it. There's nothing scientific about it. There's no research that says that any one thing is, as far as drug goes, is the thing that launches. One and done doesn't exist. You don't do one line and you're an ad. That's just nonsense. It's just not true. It's mythic. So we need to get rid of those myths because, again, those stand in the way of really getting to the point of the reason why somebody's engaging in this relationship in the first place. So the gateway and susceptibility to a relationship that's necessarily problematic and chaotic with a substance like cocaine, even alcohol, which is a state-sanctioned one, but it is the most devastating drug, which is ironic, isn't it? By 300% causes more problems and struggles with one's health than any other drug on the planet Earth. Okay, that is the one. That's the apex predator in terms of what it does to people who develop a problematic relationship. So let's think about that for a second. Why is that state sanctioned and other drugs like marijuana putting in a classification the same as heroin or cocaine or anything like that? So no, marijuana is not the gateway. CBD is certainly not a gateway. Nothing is a gateway. I would say the only thing that I would now put in place of that statement, the gateway is something sociological, something environmental, something emotional, something that happened to someone. And everybody look up adverse childhood experiences. These are traumas that happen in kids' lives. It's the thing that happens from the time you're 0 to 7, normally, in your family environment that causes you to develop a worldview, changes your nervous system from one of connection to protection. These are all things we can look up. They're all scientifically researched and validated that necessarily send somebody on a trajectory towards looking for that relief. Now, if you live in an environment where people are already using drugs and substances like that to deal with stress, then more than likely you're going to engage in those same behaviors. That's modeling, right? Everyone does that in your environment as parents. So think about that. So we don't make excuses. We just don't blame. We no blame, but still responsibility. And we're all responsible, right? If we all have that context, we would look at people differently. We would look at them totally differently. We would look at them and say, well, of course you do that, instead of, why do you do that? That's ridiculous. Why do you keep doing that? That doesn't make any sense. Stop doing that. Stop doing that. That there's no context to that. There's no understanding. There's no what happened to you. There's no abuse. There's no sexual abuse. There's no verbal, physical, none of it, right? And that person had a real experience that changed the trajectory of their lives. Now, I also want to say that this is very important. It's not black or white, okay? It's not one way or the other way, okay? Trauma is subjective. That's the reason why people who go to war, people who came back from Afghanistan, not everyone came back with PTSD. But if you did, there's a reason, and we need to address that reason. And the people and veterans, that's one of the things that really gets me upset at a high level, how we treated our veterans who come by this very naturally, of having this developing maladaptive coping strategies. Sports figures as well. We need to, and it's already happened, as you guys know, baseball, and we're starting to look at marijuana, different cannabis as a medicine instead of a drug, right? And I would suggest that all of it is medicine. It just depends on your relationship with it, right? You can use it medically in terms of lowering stress. Why do we have bars? And by the way, I want to say something about bars. Bars are, first of all, prohibition didn't work. That's the reason why it ended, right, for alcohol. But what did we do in place of that? We controlled it. We made sure the supply was safe. We have all these regulations and these taxes. And we also have safe consumption sites. They're called bars. Okay. These are places where you can go and safely consume a substance that has been tested, that is pure, that doesn't have poison in it, in addition to what alcohol is already, right? So let's think about that. Let's think about the duplicity. Let's think about the hypocrisy in terms of the way that we look at a state-sanctioned drug that does the most damage versus something like cannabis, which is incredibly safe compared to some of these other drugs that people are ingesting, either recreationally or because they have addiction. So we need to put this stuff in context, guys. This is the key to the door that is going to turn this around. And we can do it. Again, what I also want people to take away from this is this. Use your power of decision to make a decision in your own community, to go to your local leadership and say, let's start looking at this from the human perspective. What has happened to this person? Why are they engaging in this? Not that we already know because they're an alcoholic or an addict or a substance abuser or any of these things that tell inaccurate stories. And let's stop doing that, because that will go to the bottom line of the safety of our community, the health of our community. It will all go to that. If you decide as an individual to say, hey, let's look at this different, right? Let's look at it in a way that we can get in front of it, because you can clearly see by the number of overdose deaths that have been 1 million since they've started keeping track of them. Just the overdoses on substances like opiates and heroin and opium and all that, right? For that's 1 million people. Okay, that's real. So where's the outrage? Where's the mobilization? Where's the shift in thinking? Where's the change in the way that we look at people who consume drugs? Athletes, all people, CEOs, everyone is doing it in some way. It's just when they get to the point of problematic and chaotic use, we punish them. We've got to stop doing this. This is a health issue. We need to change the way we look at this. We will save mothers, brothers, sisters, lovers like you can't believe. Once each one of you individuals out there listening to this says, you know what, I'm going to take a look at this in a different way. I haven't decided yet. It's okay. But I'm going to get curious about why hasn't it worked so far? Why have we spent $1 trillion on the war on drugs and we're losing? Okay. We're smarter than this. We're better than this. We can make different decisions. So let's do it.
Tim, remind our listeners and our viewers once again why you're qualified to say the things that you're saying.
Yeah. So first of all, I came to the experience of addiction totally honestly in my family situation. Intergenerational, we've had people who were traumatized who, used alcohol as medicine to deal with the trauma, the memories, the upset central nervous system, which is what happens with trauma that knocks you out of your orbit, and you need some coping strategy. We all cope every day. We all have coping strategies. Some maladapt, but that's the point, isn't it? It's like if I don't have a proper intervention that allows me to do something in a way that doesn't give me negative consequences, like the chaotic use of alcohol or some other drug, I'm sorry, but that's just one of my basic human needs, is the relief of pain. So pardon me if that's what I'm going to do and you can't stop me. Okay. So we need a high level intervention that respects the experience, right? So I had the experience. I had physical abuse, verbal abuse, sexual abuse. And then I tried to navigate the world based on what that did to me, how that changed me, how that changed the way I trusted people, how it changed the way I viewed myself, how I did all of my relationships, lack of trust. I couldn't fully connect with you. I didn't trust you, right? That came from all of those experiences. So you have millions of people walking around with this lens, with this trauma lens, with this what happened to me lens that causes this behavior. And if you don't have an intervention that explains that, they just don't get it, while everyone's telling them, stop acting that way, stop doing that. That's frustrating. That's not getting us to where we need to go in terms of this humanification of the experience of addiction and mental health and emotional health. We need to be able to have the language that says, oh, I recognize this behavior. Now we can give you the proper intervention. Okay. So I didn't have any of that. I reached about 36 years old. I was mobile homeless. It's a high bottom for all of you out there who've had bottoms. I had a car and I had a phone with a little bit of time left on it. Okay. That's a pretty high bottom compared to some other people. But the point is what I had in common with everybody, whether you were experiencing it at the penthouse right here at the Ritz-Carlton, or whether you were under a bridge, is that we were experiencing a pain that could not be solved. And we found a solution that actually exacerbated the problem and caused more negative consequences. But it was accessible, it was easy access, and that's what we did. And pardon me for doing that. But what we need at a high level is an intervention that says, I recognize that behavior, that's trauma. What happened to you? Let's have a conversation driven by compassion that says, dude, you've got this. In fact, you have the main outcome. This is another thing I want to leave with everybody. Most people recover. Okay, guys? When I told you there's 23 million people out there who are in remission from a substance use disorder at least a year, spread the word. Okay. Now this is about how do we reduce the career? Where do we find the proper intervention so people don't have to go 9 years, 10 years and have all of that stuff happen to them, lose jobs, lose relationships, continue to feel bad, suicide. That's a whole nother subject matter, right? All of that is important. But what we can keep this simple. Let's keep it very simple as the final message. Reject stigma, reject label. They tell inaccurate stories. Ask people what happened to them, not what's the matter with them. Let's learn their stories, okay? Let's respect of what we have in common in those stories, which is sadness, frustration, anger, pain, okay? Can we all relate to that? Yes. So by tearing down the walls of stigma, now we can be relational. Now we can stop punishing people. Now we can give hope, okay? So we keep it simple, folks. We can get out in front of this. Each one is an individual. Reject the stigma, reject the label. If you go to my website, widewonder.life, there's a whole section that will teach you very simply what to implement in your own family system or your own business. Widewonder.life. You can download these sheets and you can print them off and you can have them to refer to so you can start to build your defense and your action plan to reject stigma. Because again, that's what's holding everything back. Believing that somebody's a criminal or somebody's a deviant or somebody's immoral or somebody just doesn't get it or doesn't want to quit or any of these things that are just mythology. It's just mythologic. It's not true. So go to widewonder.life and download those things. Start sharing them with your friends, sharing them with your family. Because this is going to be a grassroots movement. We have an entrenched system that is very resistant to change. So if we start in our families by rejecting these labels, that tell inaccurate stories about people we love and people we know, that's going to force the people who are necessarily a little bit intractable or a lot intractable to start to change the way that we do this.
Tim, so you talked about people having trauma and the importance of us uncovering what that trauma is. I think one of the challenges is that it's an uncomfortable conversation for most people to start digging into it. They don't know how to in the first place. And even if they did, they feel some type of discomfort in kind of maybe in their sense attacking you. How do we get past that? And what's the best way for the average person out there when they recognize that something may be going on but don't necessarily understand it, to ask the questions that can lead to help?
Yeah, this is everything that I do in the family system, because by the time somebody is calling me and they've been through several treatment episodes, the main block for a person who's experienced trauma of some kind is shame. So at a high level, we get to understand shame. Look, there's very few people on planet Earth that don't have some relationship to shame on some level. Certainly guilt, the difference between guilt and shame is important. Shame is something that I think I am, and guilt is something that I did. So that's a huge chasm, because shame says that I am that thing, right? So shame is that I am what I've been described as a label or as a stereotype, right? So really important that we recognize shame as being one of the big toxic barriers or frictions that we have to get through, both as a family system or any system and as an individual. And personally, how I did that was that somebody started talking to me about what that meant and how that was connected to the reason why I was blocked from being able to be vulnerable, like you're talking about, Roy, to be able to just say out loud, this happened to me, okay? So that's pretty high level. Now, what I also want to say to anybody out there who is struggling or knows somebody, you can engage in a therapeutic process that will help start to regulate your central nervous system so that you're not triggered all the time to necessarily react in a way that maybe that painkiller, maybe a drink, maybe a line, maybe whatever, because it's instantaneous and it works. There's a reason why we do these things, because they work. Okay, let's just be honest about that. There's a cost benefit for sure, but the benefit is very, very strong. Okay, these drugs work very efficiently in terms of getting rid of the pain, making you feel temporarily confident, and you can get through this and stuff like that. But there is a way to engage in a therapeutic process. What I want you all to look up is somatic experiencing, okay? Because trauma exists in the body. This is where it hides. This is where it lives. Trauma lives in the body, okay? So somatic is physical, is body, okay? So the somatic experiencing process, this is something that's going to get more and more known, okay? Look that up. Also look up EMDR, okay? These are two processes whereby you can engage in a therapeutic relationship without having to tell anybody what happened to you. Okay, so if you're not ready to share the shame, you're not ready to break the shame barrier and say, I'm just going to own this finally in my life, okay, do this, look this up, okay. Also look up things like, we're going to talk a little bit about emotional regulation that can get you through things, okay, as a process. So if you're not quite ready, because like Roy, you bring up a great point. This is really important. People are willing to be vulnerable and share some of these really deep things at a certain point. And usually that comes with maturity or time, okay? But if we want to do an intervention earlier so people don't have to continue to struggle and suffer for so long, we have these tools, somatic experiencing, EMDR. Look these up. Look up books about trauma. There's a book called The Body Keeps the Score. This book was written 20 years ago, and it's literally back on the bestseller list because trauma is a trending word, folks. It is. And that's a good thing. And there's also another side to that. But let's focus on the positive, and that is understanding in context why you behave or believe the things you believe, or why the relationships you've been in have been so difficult, and why you've had difficulty navigating the landscape that is the human landscape, which is all relational to self and others. So look those up, look into how and why the body stores trauma and how you can work through that. So those are really some good tips. I also want you to look at some apps. There's some apps out there that have to do with tapping. This is about emotional regulation, okay? So in the moment when you're triggered by your traumas, by your stressors, there's some really cool sort of instant ways, if you will, where you can start to regulate that central nervous system. And tapping is one of those things that it can be very immediate. So if you're struggling, and you can go to the bath, you can go to your car, you can take a walk, you can do whatever you want, and you can do some tapping either on the meridians or on these parts of the body that are energetic that can calm the central nervous system. So when we talk about the reasons why people end up using chaotically and problematically, it really is related to how I deal with stressors, how I deal with shame, how I deal with the thought of being abused, how I deal with the failures, how I deal with the death of my fill in the blank, how I deal with the divorce, how I deal with the loss of job. All of those things go to, I need to cope, I'm in pain, right? Let's be honest, folks, we're not the best in this country in dealing with these kinds of stressors and emotional regulation. We're not giants in this area. It's the reason why we have not just substance challenges in terms of addiction where you are sick and need an acute care situation, but just, mommy's drinking wine, it's wine o'clock somewhere, or any of these things where we try to normalize what it is to ingest when it's really about regulating our nervous system and our stressors.
Thanks, Tim. I think you've given us so much to think about, and I know having gone through it personally, you really bring a perspective that's valuable. It's not somebody that's just studied this from the outside and looked at it from an academic perspective or exercise. You've lived through it most of your life and most of your adult life, and really worked in a dedicated fashion to do that. So we want to thank you for taking the time to join us out here. Join Kayla and I on Radio Row at the Super Bowl. at the Los Angeles Convention Center. I know that this is something that's so important for many families, some that recognize that this is an issue now, many others that may not yet have reached that realization. And for many athletes have shared that stress and pressure that you felt from a young age from sports and utilized some of these substances to escape and soothe that stress and pressure. So I want to thank you for joining Sports Philanthropy Network today.
Can I just say one more thing, Roy, about the athletes? Because this is the biggest event. This is the apex event for sports in the world. And what I want to say about it is that pain is a real strong motive in both directions, both at cost and benefit. Right? Pain is the touchstone of. Somebody said pain is the touchstone of spiritual growth. It is the motivator. So what I want to say about that is that if you're in pain, that's not a stopgap. That's not the end. Think about it as the beginning, as the gateway that you can go through on the other side, which is everything we've been looking for, which is acceptance of self and what happened to you. And if you're a man especially, and I think this is super important, there's a set of man rules that we were given, either directly, indirectly, or that's just in the culture. And that is, never let them see you sweat. Don't share your emotions. Don't cry. All those things. Everybody knows if you're a male in this society, that really are they're the wall to getting help. Okay? So in your private moments, realize that those weren't your ideas. Somebody else set those ideas up. They're not yours and they're not law. So if you're feeling pain and you're ashamed of your pain and where it came from, just realize that those laws don't apply to you. Write them down and put them in a trash can and burn them if you have to. But on the other side of that pain, which is driving you to the success that you've reached in sports or in business or whatever it is, that is a motivator. I'll show you at some point there's a reckoning. And we see the reckonings and we see the results of those reckonings in the media, especially at a high level with professional athletes. But we've also seen them say, I'm going to bow out of this competition because I need to take care of myself. So that's the changing of the guard. Disregard the male rules, the man rules, throw them out, and ask for help. And you'll never regret it.
I love it. Tim is the founder and Chief Empowerment Officer of Family Addiction Recovery Services, Sustainable Recovery Intervention Services Incorporated, and co-founder of Wide Wonder Zero Stigma Education Services. Folks, if you want to find Timothy, you can find him on LinkedIn. Timothy Harrington, HARRINGTON. We thanked him for joining us today and ask you to join us, the Sports Philanthropy Network, in building stronger, healthier, and more inclusive communities. Sports. You can find us at sportsphilanthropy.org. On behalf of Roy Kessel, Tim Harrington, and myself, we want to say thank you for joining the Sports Philanthropy Network on location at Super Bowl 56. Thanks, guys.